We are moving into a new unit. This is going to be Unit 13, where we're going to look at the major changes in society after World War II that are kind of occurring at the same time with many of the conflicts between the Soviet Union that we talked about in Unit 12. Okay, so our big thing today in Unit 1, we'll be looking at the Civil Rights Movement. So, just to kind of go on a little bit of a review here. Okay, so the modern day civil rights movement happens between the 1950s and 1970s. And kind of going back to, some of the images that you see here will be major changes in the shift of how African Americans are treated in the United States. So remember, going back to a previous lesson earlier in the year, after the Civil War, when slavery is abolished, the South is heavily segregated. Segregate means separated, right? So, for example, when you look at the picture on the top right, you have separate drinking fountains, separate bathrooms, separate waiting rooms in hospitals, and they are not equal at all. So, this is, kind of a symptom of racism in the United States, especially following the Civil War. So the Jim Crow laws were enforced in the South. As I said, schools, hospital, transportation with buses and trains, also restaurants. And there's two types of segregation. De jure segregation means segregation by the law. So it's a law that things must be separate. This is allowed to happen after the Supreme Court case in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, that established the phrase separate but equal. But as I said, like these things were not equal, right? Thinking to schools, there are white schools and black schools. The white schools would get all of the new textbooks, all of the new furniture, and all the old furniture and textbooks would get sent to the black schools. So segregation really set up a separate society in the South. But there was also segregation in the North as well. And this was called de facto segregation, meaning that it's segregated by choice, that it's a tradition and a way of life. It's not necessarily like a law that says things are segregated, but it's just like, you can see this when you look at cities, right? Oh, don't go into that neighborhood. White people don't go to that neighborhood at night. That's de facto segregation. That segregation happens by unwritten custom or tradition. So how this occurred in the North was blacks were segregated and denied housing in many neighborhoods and faced discrimination in employment. They often worked the dirtiest, lowest paying jobs. And that kind of created a society that was separate. So we didn't necessarily have to have it written down that this is the way things were. It just was the way that things happened by choice. So, what impact did segregation have? From the period of 1865, which is again the end of the Civil War, until the mid 1960s, so you're talking 100 years later, African Americans would be trapped in many low paying jobs. They had a lot of higher rates of poverty, also higher rates of illiteracy, which is not knowing how to read or write. They had much lower rates of home ownership and also lower life expectancies because many of the jobs they did in places they lived were very polluted. And that led to a very small life expectancy. And a lot of this still happens today. We're still seeing higher rates of asthma in neighborhoods and cities that are predominantly Black and low income. And in the South, especially, there were a lot of threats for Black Americans that were intending on voting. So, and just to review, Plessy versus Ferguson, right? So, Homer Plessy was a white passing. What I mean by white passing is he was Black, but he had lighter skin. He took a seat in the whites only car of a train, refused to move. He was arrested and convicted for breaking the segregation law. So the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, where we're looking at whether or not that separating blacks and whites on railroad cars legal. It was a split decision that found as long as things were separate but equal, did not violate the 14th Amendment. But this will be overturned in 1954. The group that we've earlier discussed, the NAACP, is the National Advancement for colored people challenged this separate but equal ruling, and they felt as though that if they used the court system to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson, that this could help to get equality. So Brown versus Board of Education was a case where the Supreme Court overturns the Plessy versus Ferguson ruling. They say that segregated public schools violates the Constitution. It had massive effects since it touched many Americans. But there also led to great opposition to the ruling that the South would not be integrated. So we're going to start to have multiple battles between Black Southerners trying to integrate schools. Integrate is the opposite of segregate. When you integrate, you're bringing people together. So we're trying to, integrate the schools and have both whites and Blacks in the same school. And this will lead to major fights that we'll mention later on here. So in Brown versus Board of Education, Linda Brown's parents wanted her to attend the school that was closest to where she lived. Kansas state law argued that she had to attend a segregated school, so the NAACP uses this as an opportunity to test the law. So can Linda Brown attend an all-white school? The decision says that separate educational facilities were unequal, and desegregation would begin to be required across the country. So this is happening as the civil rights movement is growing. You have the Congress of Racial Equality, also known as CORE, that becomes convinced that it's going to be non-violent methods that will allow Black Americans to gain civil rights. They organize protests in northern cities. Jackie Robinson is the first man to break the color barrier in baseball. He plays for the Brooklyn Dodgers. And he integrates baseball in the 1940s. He was a really great athlete and faced a ton of discrimination, but he was able to kind of open the baseball world to Black athletes. Prior to this, Black athletes had what were known as the Negro Leagues. They had their own baseball teams, but now we're going to have more Black men join the Major League Baseball league. President Truman also, who's president after World War II, uses his executive power to desegregate the military. So even through World War II, the military had been segregated. As we move into the 1950s with Truman, that will change. So how does the NAACP challenge segregation? They became the largest and most powerful civil rights organization. The most famous name from the NAACP was Thurgood Marshall. He headed a team that challenged the legality of segregation. He was a lawyer that would take on a lot of these court cases. Later on, he'll become the first African American to be chosen to be on the Supreme Court. So kind of one thing that spurs and brings change when it comes, if you're like, why the 1950s or now all of a sudden we're going to fight for civil rights again? It had a lot to do with World War II. You had African Americans who fought in the war, and when they return home from fighting, they're treated as second-class citizens. And they feel as though, they were overseas defending freedom for other people in other countries. And then when they came back to their own country, they did not have the freedom they had just fought for. So many of them begin to fight back. So the civil rights movement was broad and diverse, and it hoped to attain racial equality. So as I said, some of the notable leaders, you had Thurgood Marshall. He's the one that takes the fight to the courts. I'm sure you've probably heard of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks was a woman who refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white man. She's arrested for refusing to follow the law, and this leads to the Montgomery bus boycott, where Black people living in Montgomery refused to ride the bus, and they were a huge ridership of the bus system. So they basically almost bankrupted the bus because of this boycott. Remember, boycott is when you don't do something or don't buy something. So they wouldn't take the bus in order to stand with Rosa Parks. And then obviously, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gains national prominence as a leader during the Montgomery bus boycott. He's arrested in Birmingham. He writes a famous primary source called Letter from a Birmingham Jail. So how did they do it? The civil rights movement was very different because it's going to use nonviolent protest, where we're not going to be fighting with fists. We're not going to be, attacking people. We're not going to be violent. We're going to be disobedient, meaning, sit-ins, walks, and we're also going to use legal action to help change the United States. So what is civil disobedience? It's a form of nonviolent protest. So some examples of civil disobedience you have here. We have boycotts, refusing to buy goods or services from a business, hunger strikes, refusing to eat anything in order to get attention for your cause, petitions where you write letters to the government or a company to change their policy and getting people to sign it. The civil rights movement used a lot of marches and demonstrations where getting as many people as possible to gather in one place to get attention to your cause. And then obviously strikes as well, where you're refusing to work in order to force your managers or governance to change their policy. Breaking the law or causing a disturbance in order to get your attention for a cause. Another big thing that the civil rights movement used were sit-ins, where protesters come into a place, sit down, and refuse to move. If you've been following any current events lately, these are some of the methods that are being used by protesters across college campuses today, where we have pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian protests on many college campuses today, and they're utilizing a lot of these same messages. So why do you choose civil disobedience? Because you're not doing anything. So you ultimately end up frustrating the aggressor to where, you're not moving, they want you to move, so you want them to move you, and they look like the bad guys. And that's really what the civil rights movement was all about. So legal action is when lawyers can challenge a law or policy. If they can convince the judge that the law or policy is unconstitutional, then the judge will order them to change. People can speak at government hearings or meetings to try to convince legislators to make new laws or repeal unfair ones. And this is something that we use at all levels of government, where the public is allowed to comment from, the local city council and school committee all the way up to people can kind of speak through their representation at the federal government level as well. So Rosa Parks, I just kind of explained. The bus companies in many places in Alabama had a rule that said all African Americans had to sit in the back of the bus. Rosa Parks was coming home from work and was tired. This is the famous story. Really, this was planned. She had been trained at what to do, and she gets arrested. So this leads to, as I said, the Montgomery bus boycott. Her actions transform the movement. The NAACP begins to prepare a legal challenge, but Martin Luther King kind of emerges and urges nonviolence. The boycott of the Montgomery buses lasts an entire year. And then eventually the Supreme Court will rule in favor of the law being unconstitutional again. So, what effects do boycotts and things like this have? It revealed that the power of African Americans could have if they joined together. So you have a couple of organizations that are formed. Martin Luther King establishes the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who advocated nonviolent resistance. You also have a group called SNCC, which is going to be students. And in Greensboro, North Carolina, they protest at lunch counters, whereas African Americans, they were not allowed to sit. But you also have many white students who come to support their fellow Black peers, which also, gives more attention to the movement as well. So here you have, people would go in and they would sit in at these counters. Most of the time they would refuse to be served, but what would happen is, eventually they would be forcibly attacked and removed. So here you have some pictures of people sitting at the lunch counters and kind of being, had food poured on them. They were spit on. Some of them are violently, assaulted by white Southerners who, are trying to stop the type of change that these people are fighting for. You have an Edpuzzle that talks further about the Little Rock Nine, where you have 9 students who want to integrate Little Rock High School in Arkansas. President Eisenhower is forced to send in federal troops. Again, because what will happen in the South is the South will say, the Supreme Court ruled this, but who's going to tell us what to do? Who's going to enforce it? And in this case, it's going to be the federal government that needs to send in troops. So for an entire school year, federal troops stayed in Little Rock escorting students to and from school. And why did they need to do that? You can see on the top right here. They were heckled. They, again, were spit on. They were screamed at as this happened. So the Little Rock Nine showed that the president would not tolerate an open defiance of Supreme Court law. But a lot of Southern states are just as they did in Black codes and Jim Crow, they're going to find ways around this to resist desegregation. And it'll be years before Black and white children went together. So if you go back to the Little Rock Nine, okay, this is happening in about 1959. If you've ever seen the movie Remember the Titans, that's happening in 1970. So this is something that is going to take time. So after the Little Rock Nine, we have Jane Meredith, who tries to become the first Black student to integrate Mississippi, Old Miss, as it's also known, the University of Mississippi, and JFK is forced to send in troops again. You have the governor in this picture on the top right. The governor of the entire state is there trying to stop this from happening. You have riots, you have people that are killed. So JFK once again orders the federal government. So the South, as I said, will be a huge place that this will kind of be the face of what's going on. But you also have, with the letter from a Birmingham jail, the focus turned to Birmingham, Alabama. You have freedom marches where school children, so young kids, and this is where sometimes people say the civil rights movement was a little controversial because people assumed that if children took part in the demonstrations that the police are not going to assault children, but they found other ways around doing that. Many Americans were shocked by watching this on the news every night, people being attacked by dogs, people being sprayed with fire hoses. So as people are seeing this on the news, they're really upset about this. So Kennedy approves moving forward with a civil rights bill. This event culminates with a march from Birmingham, Alabama to Selma, Alabama. And as, they are marched, they are attacked. Again, live on national television in everyone's living rooms. And the attention is really what will help put forward the civil rights cause. August 28th, 1963 is, the famous I Have a Dream speech. More than 200,000 people show up. It's one of the largest political demonstrations that we've had, and it became a model for what peaceful protests looked like. The whole purpose of this was to put pressure on Congress to pass the bill. So how did the voting rights bill? The South had passed laws like making it mandatory for people to pass literacy tests. We also had people being required to pay poll taxes or just openly being intimidated. And this is how we would stop people of color from voting. So finally, in 1964, the civil rights movement, the big moment that happens is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It ends racial discrimination in public facilities such as restrooms, restaurants, buses, movie theaters, and swimming pools. It bans segregation in public places. It gives the federal government the ability to desegregate schools that were still resisting integration. People that violated people's civil rights could be prosecuted under law. It outlawed discrimination in employment, and it also established the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The Voting Rights Act in 1965 will follow this, and then we'll kind of talk about, these are all really positive wins of the civil rights movement. But as we get to the end of the 1960s and things in the country become a lot more tense and tumultuous, that this movement will really shift and change. And we'll talk more about that in lesson 2.